The dust of a late summer afternoon in 1860 Missouri clung to everything. The coarse wool of Abel's jacket, the grimy glass of the saloon window, and the bitter taste of cheap whiskey on his tongue. It was a kind of dust that felt personal, a constant gritty reminder of a world that was always moving, always shifting, yet offered no easy path forward. For Abel, a man whose past was a tapestry of hard labor and broken promises, the town of Redemption was supposed to be a new beginning. But the quiet, oppressive air of the place felt less like redemption and more like a sentence. He nursed his drink, the clinking of glasses and low murmur of conversation in the saloon, a distant hum. His eyes, weary from years spent under a scorching sun, were fixed on the street. A lone horseman rode past, his silhouette a fleeting shadow against the orange sky. This was a land of shadows, where every stranger was a potential threat, and every friendly face a carefully constructed mask. Abel had learned that lesson the hard way. His gaze drifted to the imposing stone structure at the edge of town, the Mount Zion Church. It stood on a small hill, its spire piercing the bruised sky like a solemn finger pointed at an indifferent heaven. The church was an anomaly in the raw, untamed landscape of the frontier. Unlike the hastily built wooden shacks and dirt-floor taverns, it was a work of meticulous, old-world craftsmanship. It was said to have been built by a reclusive German immigrant community that had settled here decades ago, a community that had since vanished, leaving behind only their strange, somber monument. The local townsfolk, a mix of rugged frontiersmen and weary farmers, rarely spoke of the church. They went about their business, eyes downcast, as if a glance in its direction might summon something they weren't ready to face. Abel's first night in Redemption, he had heard the singing. It wasn't the joyful, boisterous hymns one might expect from a Sunday service. This was a low, guttural chanting, a sorrowful melody that seemed to snake its way through the very foundations of the town. It was a sound that didn't feel like worship. It felt like a plea, a desperation. Abel had asked about it, trying to strike up a conversation with the saloon keeper, a man named Silas with a permanent scowl etched onto his face. "That's just the choir, son," Silas had grunted, wiping a mug with a dirty rag. "They're a bit fervent. Keep to yourselves, the lot of 'em. No harm in it." But there was harm in the sound. Abel felt it in his bones, a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the evening chill. The singing grew louder as the night wore on, a cacophony of voices that seemed to blend and blur, becoming something else entirely. Something sharper, a wail, a scream. He'd dismissed it, told himself the whiskey was playing tricks on him, the wind perhaps, or a stray animal. But the sound had a human quality to it, a terrible agonizing resonance. The next morning, the town was quiet. The air hung thick and heavy, and Abel felt the silent, unspoken tension between the people. No one mentioned the sounds of the previous night. It was as if a collective amnesia had washed over Redemption, a quiet agreement to ignore the impossible. This conspiracy of silence, this shared secret, was what truly terrified Abel. He had come to Redemption seeking refuge from his own past, a past he had tried to outrun. But the town's past was a tangible thing, a ghost that walked among the living. He saw it in the guarded eyes of the shopkeepers, in the nervous twitch of the blacksmith's hand, in the way a young boy on the street would stop his play and stare, unblinking, at the church on the hill. He finished his drink and pushed the empty glass away. He couldn't stay. He had to pack his saddlebags and be on his way before the sun rose. But as he turned to leave, a young woman hurried into the saloon. She was no older than 20, her face pale and streaked with tears. She clutched a small leather-bound book to her chest, her knuckles white. She looked around the room, her eyes darting from face to face, searching for a sign of recognition, a flicker of help. No one met her gaze. They looked away, feigning interest in their drinks, their cards, the floorboards. The silence in the room was deafening. "Please," she whispered, her voice a fragile thing. "He's gone. He went to the church and he didn't come back." The silence held. No one moved. No one spoke. The woman's eyes finally landed on Abel. He was the only one looking at her. The others were ghosts, lost in their self-imposed ignorance. He felt a terrible pull, a familiar mix of dread and a fool's courage. He had promised himself he would stay out of trouble, that he would leave the ghosts of his past behind. But the desperation in her eyes was a language he knew all too well. It was the language of a town that had gone rotten from the inside out. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. The sound was a violation of the sacred silence of the saloon. Every eye in the room now turned to him, their gazes a silent warning. "Who are you talking about, miss?" Abel asked, his voice rough but steady. The woman's name was Sarah. Her brother, a young man named Elias, had gone to the church the night before to investigate the sounds. He had a restless spirit, she explained, a curious nature that the town had tried to beat out of him. He was tired of the silence, the fear. He had gone to find answers, and now he was gone. "The townsfolk, they won't help," she said, her voice breaking. "They say it's God's will. They're afraid." Abel looked out the window at the looming shadow of the church. The sun was gone now, and the twilight was painting the sky in shades of deep indigo and a sickly green. The first stars began to appear, but they offered no comfort, no light. He felt the cold shiver again, the same one he had felt the night before when the singing had turned to screaming. He had come to redemption to find peace, but the town had other plans. It was a place where fear was a currency and silence was a shield. The mystery of the Mount Zion Church was a cancer, and it was slowly killing the town from the inside. Elias was just the latest victim, but he wouldn't be the last. And as the night grew darker, a low, sorrowful chant began to rise from the church on the hill, a chorus of despair that seemed to welcome the darkness with open arms. If you're finding this story as gripping as we are, and you want to be here for every twist and turn, remember to subscribe to the channel. We have many more chilling stories on the way, and you won't want to miss a single one. The night air was a cold blanket, heavy with the scent of dry earth and unspoken dread. Abel followed Sarah out of the saloon, the door swinging shut behind them with a definitive thud that seemed to sever their last tie to the town's false sense of normalcy. The street was now deserted, the windows of the houses dark and shuttered, as if the entire population had retreated into their own little worlds, determined to block out the sinister symphony from the hill. "My pa, he told me not to talk to strangers," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper, a stark contrast to the resolute grip she had on her brother's journal. "But you're the only one who looked at me. The others, they pretend he never existed." Abel nodded, his gaze fixed on the dark outline of the church against the star-peppered sky. "I ain't a hero, miss. Just a man who's seen too much of folks looking the other way." They started walking toward the church, their boots crunching on the loose gravel. The silence of the night was punctuated by the rhythmic rise and fall of the chanting. It was closer now, clearer. Abel could make out individual voices, deep baritones and thin, reedy tenors, all woven together into a tapestry of sorrow. He swore he could still hear the faint, underlying current of a scream, a raw human sound buried beneath the pretense of a hymn. They reached the base of the hill and began the slow climb. The church grew larger and more imposing with every step, its stone facade a grim monument to a forgotten people. As they drew near, Abel noticed a peculiar detail. The stone was not uniform. In places it was worn smooth by time, but in others there were deep, jagged scratches, as if something had tried to claw its way out. The scratches were new, too fresh to be the work of decades of weather. The main doors were thick oak, bound with heavy iron. They were bolted shut from the outside with a massive, rusted padlock. It was an odd detail for a church that was supposed to be in use. Who locks a church from the outside during a service? He said he had a key, Sarah said, her voice trembling as she gestured toward the door. Elias, he was a stubborn one. He couldn't stand the mystery. He found a spare key in the attic of a barn owned by the local shoemaker, the man who built the church. He left a journal. Elias believed the answers were inside. Abel ran a hand over the rough-hewn stone. There was a faint metallic odor in the air, a scent that was both sharp and sweet. It reminded him of blood, though he couldn't place it. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple, despite the cool night air. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. Something was profoundly wrong. "Look," Abel said, pointing to a small, almost invisible crack in the stone near the foundation. "The lock is for show. There's a way in." They knelt, and Abel used the tip of his knife to pry at a loose stone. It came free, revealing a small, dark opening. It was just big enough for a man to squeeze through. A gust of fetid, stale air rushed out, carrying with it that same metallic scent, now much stronger. "Wait," Sarah said, her hand on his arm. She held out the leather-bound journal. "Elias wrote a note in here. He hid it in the pages of the journal before he went in." He was paranoid. He thought someone might be watching him. He wrote that the truth wasn't in the church itself, but beneath it. He wrote about a secret passage under the altar. Abel took the journal and flipped to the marked page. A small, hastily scrawled note was tucked inside. "Beneath the altar, the old ways. It's not worship, it's a harvest. Find the serpent." The words were cryptic, chillingly so. What did Elias mean by harvest? What was the serpent? "He used to talk in riddles when he was excited about something," Sarah said, her eyes welling up with new tears. "He would say things that didn't make sense to anyone but him. The serpent, I don't know." Abel closed the journal. The chanting from within grew louder, more frantic. It was a wave of sound that crashed against the walls of the church, carrying with it an undercurrent of something deeply unsettling. He thought of the town's silence, of the way the people had looked away. This wasn't just fear. It was a conscious decision to ignore a terrible truth. They were not victims of the church. They were collaborators, or at least witnesses who had turned a blind eye. He shone his lantern into the opening. The light revealed a cramped, dirt-floored tunnel sloping downwards. It was the color of dried mud and dust, and the air was thick with the scent of earth and something else he couldn't name. He looked at Sarah, her face illuminated by the lantern's weak glow, her eyes wide with a mix of terror and grim determination. He knew he could turn back. He could tell her there was nothing he could do and ride out of town before dawn. But the image of her face in the saloon, of her quiet plea for help while a whole town looked away, was seared into his mind. He couldn't. "I'm going in," he said. "I'm coming with you," she said, her voice no longer a whisper. It was steady, resolute. He didn't argue. He knew that if he tried to stop her, she would just find her own way in, and he couldn't leave her alone with the mysteries of this place. Abel squeezed through the opening first, his shoulders scraping against the rough stone. He landed softly on the packed dirt floor of the tunnel. Sarah followed. They moved slowly, their lantern casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The air grew heavier, the metallic smell more pronounced. The tunnel twisted and turned, and with every step, the sound of the chanting grew fainter, muffled by the earth around them. The tunnel was long, much longer than Abel had anticipated. Just when he was starting to think they had gone in the wrong direction, the tunnel opened up into a larger space. It was a small cavern, naturally formed, and at the far end, a narrow set of stone steps led upwards. The air here was different, colder. On the walls of the cavern, someone had scrawled strange markings, symbols that looked like a crude language, a series of lines and circles. It was not German, or any language Abel had ever seen. The serpent, he thought. They crept up the steps, and as they neared the top, a low, rhythmic thudding became audible. It was a sound that made the ground tremble slightly, not the chanting. This was different, deeper, more deliberate. They reached the top of the steps and found themselves in a hidden space beneath the church's altar. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and a pervasive chemical smell. And then Abel saw it. A massive iron lever, worn smooth by countless hands, stood next to a heavy wooden door. A new detail, horrifyingly simple, caught his eye. The door was marked with the same jagged claw marks he had seen on the outside of the church. The marks were not a sign of an escape attempt, but a warning. A message for those who might come looking. The harvest was a grim reality. The thudding grew louder, and from behind the wooden door, a faint groan could be heard. It was not a sound of worship. It was a sound of suffering. Abel and Sarah exchanged a look of shared horror. The town's silence was now a screaming accusation. They were standing on the precipice of a secret so terrible it had poisoned an entire community. They were about to find out what had happened to Elias, and in doing so, they would risk the same fate. The groan behind the wooden door was a raw, unfiltered sound of human agony, a stark contrast to the performative chanting happening above their heads. Abel's hand hovered over the lever, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The air was thick with tension, a suffocating blanket of dread. He looked at Sarah, her face pale in the lantern light, her eyes wide with terror but also a desperate need to know. "We can't go in there," she whispered, the words barely audible. What if they're still here?" "They're not here," Abel said, his voice low and firm, though he wasn't sure. "That sound, it's a warning, not a sign of life. We gotta find what Elias was talking about. The harvest." He moved past the door and began to inspect the walls of the cavern. The strange markings were everywhere, etched into the stone. They looked less like a language and more like a map. He traced a pattern with his finger, the lines leading in a direction he hadn't noticed before, towards a narrow fissure in the rock face. "Over here," he said, his voice cutting through the thick silence. The fissure was barely wide enough to fit through, and it led to another, smaller tunnel. As they moved, the smell of damp earth gave way to a sickly, sweet stench. It was the smell of decay. Abel raised his lantern, and the weak light revealed something on the tunnel floor. A small, wooden box. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. It was a familiar box, one her brother had made himself, intricately carved with small birds and flowers. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried leaves, was a lock of hair and a small tarnished silver locket. It was Elias's. "He left a trail," Sarah choked out, a sob catching in her throat. "He knew he might not come back. He wanted us to find him." They pushed on, the tunnel widening into a small, claustrophobic chamber. On the floor, a makeshift altar had been constructed from flat stones. At its center was a grotesque effigy carved from bone and wood, its face a distorted mask of pain. The figure was wrapped in what looked like dried leaves, and at its base a small circular impression was dug into the earth. "The serpent," Abel said, the word a bitter taste in his mouth. He knelt and pushed the dirt away from the impression. It was not a serpent at all. It was the symbol of a hammer and sickle, a crude representation of a mining tool and a farming tool carved into the floor. This wasn't some strange religious cult. This was a conspiracy of the earth, of what lay beneath it. Suddenly a sound from the tunnel behind them made them both freeze. It was the unmistakable scrape of boots on stone. Someone was coming. They extinguished their lantern and huddled against the back wall, their hearts pounding in unison. A figure emerged, his face half obscured by the flickering light of his own lamp. It was Silas, the saloon keeper. But he wasn't alone. Another man, a townsman Abel had seen working at the blacksmith shop, followed him. They were wearing dark cloaks, and their faces were grim and determined. Silas held a small pouch in his hand, and as he spoke, his voice was low and menacing. "He's not here, Silas," the blacksmith whispered. "We've looked everywhere. The old man, he knows we're here." "He's hiding," Silas hissed, his voice devoid of the gruff kindness he had shown in the saloon. "He's a fool. Thinks he can mess with the harvest." He knelt by the effigy, and with a small silver trowel from his pouch, he began to dig, not in the circle but to the side, where a loose rock had been placed. Abel's mind raced. He had been a miner once. In a past life he tried to forget. He knew the signs. The loose rock, the metallic smell, the makeshift tools. The harvest wasn't souls or faith. It was something tangible, something beneath the ground. But what? Silas pulled a small, leather-bound book from a hole under the rock. It was a ledger. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the entries. Abel and Sarah exchanged a silent look. They had to get that book. It was the key to everything. It was the reason Elias had disappeared. He had gotten too close to the truth. As Silas and the blacksmith prepared to leave, a gust of wind from the tunnel above them extinguished their lantern. In the sudden darkness, Abel moved. He lunged forward, tackling Silas, sending the ledger flying. The blacksmith shouted in surprise, swinging his lantern wildly. It crashed against the wall, shattering. The cavern was plunged into darkness. Abel grappled with Silas, the man's strength surprising him. Silas was no longer the old, gruff saloon keeper. He was a man fighting for his life, and he had a terrifying ferocity. The blacksmith was fumbling for a weapon, his heavy breathing filling the small space. "Fool," Silas snarled, his fist connecting with Abel's jaw. "You shouldn't have come here. You'll regret this." Abel gritted his teeth, his vision swimming. He threw a punch connecting with Silas's nose. He heard the crunch of bone. Silas groaned and fell back, and Abel scrambled to his feet, fumbling in the dark for the ledger. His fingers brushed against something hard and leathery. He grabbed it and ran, pulling Sarah behind him. They stumbled back through the winding tunnels, the sound of Silas and the blacksmith shouting and cursing echoing behind them. They burst out of the fissure and scrambled up the dirt path towards the church entrance, the night air a welcome relief. They didn't stop until they were back on the main road, hidden behind a thick stand of trees. Abel leaned against a rough tree trunk, his jaw throbbing, his lungs burning. Sarah was shaking, but she was holding on tight to a small, heavy object. "We got it," she breathed, holding up the ledger. It was a thick, worn book, its cover slick with blood. Silas's blood. Abel took it from her, his hands trembling. They had done it. They had the evidence. But at what cost? He looked back at the town, the dark silhouette of the church looming over it like a predator. The chanting from within had stopped. The silence was now more terrifying than the noise. They had broken the town's quiet conspiracy, and now the town was coming for them. They were no longer just curious outsiders. They were a threat. And in redemption, threats were dealt with in the dark. The cold reality of their situation settled over them like a shroud. They had the ledger, the undeniable proof of the town's sinister secret, but they were now hunted. The silence that had once protected the townsfolk was now turned against them. Every dark window, every shadowy corner seemed to hide a pair of watchful eyes. Abel led Sarah through the dense woods at the edge of town, their movements a frantic, whispered escape. The forest was an alien world to Abel, a maze of gnarled branches and rustling leaves, but it was better than the open streets. "We have to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice a low, urgent hum. "They'll find us. We can't stay. We can't just run." Abel countered, his mind racing. "We have the ledger. We need to get it to someone, a sheriff, a marshal, someone who can put a stop to this." He opened the book, using the moonlight to read the pages. The handwriting was neat and precise, a chilling contrast to the gruesome content. The ledger wasn't a record of church donations or baptisms. It was a logbook. Each page was a grim tally, names, dates, and a final coded entry. He recognized some of the names: The young boy from the street who had stared at the church, the weary farmer from the general store. Elias's name was there too, listed with a final entry marked Harvest. The entries weren't just for disappearances. Some were marked Processed, with a note about yield and extraction. It was a cold, brutal business record. They were not just kidnapping people, they were doing something to them. The word harvest now had a far more sinister meaning than Abel had first imagined. He flipped to a new section, a list of what looked like expenses. The entries were for mining equipment, chemicals, and building materials. The church was a front for a mining operation. But what were they mining that required such extreme secrecy and violence? "They're not a cult," Abel said, his voice a low, disbelieving whisper. "They're a syndicate, a mining operation." "Mining what?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "What is so valuable that they'd kill their own people for it?" Abel didn't have the answer, but he knew they couldn't risk the truth getting out while they were still within the town's reach. They needed to find a safe place, somewhere to plan their next move. They pushed deeper into the woods, following a winding creek that led away from Redemption. The night was growing colder, the moon casting long, spectral shadows that seemed to follow their every step. They were out of the town, but they were not safe. The woods were filled with the sounds of the night, the hoot of an owl, the snap of a twig, the rustle of a startled animal, but every sound made them jump. They were both hyper-aware of being watched, of being hunted. Abel's jaw throbbed, a constant painful reminder of his scuffle with Silas. He wondered how many others were in on the secret. How many of the townsfolk, the seemingly harmless shopkeepers and farmers, were complicit in this brutal business. The whole town was a web of lies, and they had just walked into the center of it. They walked for what felt like hours, their legs aching, their minds numb with fear and exhaustion. Just as the first pale light of dawn began to paint the sky, they stumbled upon an old, abandoned trapper's cabin. It was a derelict shack, its roof caved in, its windows boarded up, but it offered a measure of shelter and a place to rest. They collapsed inside, the musty smell of rotting wood and stale air, a small price to pay for a moment of safety. Abel went to the window, peering through a crack in the boarded-up panes. The sun was rising, casting a soft, golden light over the land. In the distance, the spire of the Mount Zion Church was a dark, jagged finger against the new day. It was still there, still a silent threat, a testament to the darkness that lay beneath the surface of Redemption. Abel opened the ledger again, this time to the last pages, which were filled with diagrams and sketches. They were crude, but recognizable. Blueprints of a complex system of tunnels beneath the church, a vast network of shafts and chambers. At the center of the diagrams was a large, circular chamber with a series of smaller, cell-like rooms branching off from it. The serpent wasn't a symbol of a cult. It was a crude drawing of the winding tunnels themselves. Then he saw it. A single word, scrawled at the bottom of the last page in Elias's messy handwriting: phosphorus. Abel's blood ran cold. He knew the word. Phosphorus was a rare, highly valuable mineral. It was used in matches and explosives, and it was a key component in early fertilizers. But in its raw, unprocessed form, it was highly volatile and toxic. The sweet, metallic smell he had noticed at the church. It wasn't blood. It was the distinct odor of unprocessed phosphorus. The harvest was the extraction of this mineral, and the people listed in the ledger were not being killed for a ritual. They were being used as slave labor, likely forced to work in the dangerous tunnels, their health sacrificed for profit. The screams from the church at night were not part of a hymn. They were the cries of people suffering from chemical burns or being disposed of after they became too sick to work. The terrifying truth was not that a cult was sacrificing people to a dark god. It was that a syndicate of greedy, ruthless men were kidnapping and exploiting their own community for profit, using the facade of a church to mask their crimes. The town wasn't filled with blind followers. It was filled with scared, complicit people, silenced by fear and the threat of the same grim fate. Abel looked at Sarah, who had fallen into a fitful sleep, her hand still clutching her brother's journal. He thought of all the lives on those pages, all the people who had been harvested. He thought of Elias, and the horror he must have felt when he uncovered the truth. The fear that had once driven Abel was now replaced by a burning, righteous fury. He had come to redemption to escape his past. But now he had a new purpose. He wasn't just a man on the run anymore. He was a man with a mission. He would expose them, no matter the cost. The sun rose higher, casting shafts of light through the gaps in the cabin's walls, but it did little to dispel the gloom. The air inside was thick with the dust of ages and the heavy weight of their grim discovery. Abel and Sarah huddled together, taking turns napping and keeping watch. The ledger lay open between them, its pages a horrifying account of human greed and suffering. The knowledge of the phosphorus mine, of the brutal reality behind the night church, was a heavy burden, but it also gave them clarity. The mystery was gone, replaced by a cold, tangible threat. "We have to get this to the authorities," Sarah said, her voice hoarse from fear and exhaustion. "The nearest U.S. Marshal is in Jefferson City. It's a long way, but it's our only chance." Abel nodded, but his mind was already turning over the problem. They couldn't just ride out. They were wanted. The townsfolk, complicit in their fear, would report them. The syndicate would have men posted on every road out of Redemption. They needed a plan. "We can't just leave," Abel said. "They'll be looking for us. They probably already know we have the ledger. Silas wouldn't just sit on that. He'll have told the others." As if on cue, a distant sound reached their ears, the baying of hounds. It was a chilling sound, one Abel knew all too well from his past. The hunters were coming. They scrambled to their feet, their brief sense of safety shattered. They had to move. They couldn't risk a confrontation. Abel grabbed the ledger and Sarah's journal, stuffing them into his satchel. They burst out of the cabin and plunged back into the woods, the hounds' cries growing louder behind them. The woods were a chaotic blur of green and brown. They ran, their lungs burning, their feet slipping on damp leaves and loose soil. The baying was no longer distant. It was close, terrifyingly so. They could hear the voices of men now, too. They were closing in. "This way!" Abel shouted, pulling Sarah towards a rocky outcrop. A small, dry cave was nestled at its base, hidden by thick vines. They crawled inside, their hearts pounding. The air in the cave was still and damp, smelling of earth and cool stone. They pressed themselves against the back wall, barely daring to breathe. The sounds of the hunt grew louder, the dogs' barks a frantic, frenzied symphony. They could hear the men shouting, their boots crunching on the forest floor. They were just outside. Abel held his breath, his hand on the hilt of his knife. If they were found, he wouldn't go down without a fight. He would make sure they paid for every life they had taken, for every scream that had been mistaken for a hymn. A moment stretched into an eternity. The dogs were sniffing at the entrance to the cave, their barks now low, guttural growls. Abel could see their shadows through the vines, hear their snarls. He felt a wave of cold dread wash over him. They were trapped. Then, a voice. It was Silas. "They went this way. I saw 'em." "The dogs say they're in here, Silas," another voice said, a deep, calm tone that sent a new shiver down Abel's spine. It was a voice he hadn't heard before, a voice of authority. "They're a good distance from the road now. Let's box 'em in." Abel's heart sank. They were not just hunted by the townsfolk. The syndicate had a leader, a mastermind who was now directing the search. The man's calm, measured tone was more frightening than Silas's frantic anger. It was the voice of a man who was in control, a man who believed he was untouchable. Then, a new voice cut through the air. "They're not in there, you fools. They crossed the creek a ways back. I saw their tracks." Abel and Sarah exchanged a look. The voice was unfamiliar, a woman's voice. The hunting party, after a moment of confused discussion, seemed to believe her. They started to move away, the sounds of their boots and the dog's barks fading into the distance. They remained in the cave for a long, silent time, waiting for any sign that the hunters were gone for good. When they finally crept out, the forest was silent again, save for the hum of insects and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. They looked in the direction the hunters had gone, and then in the direction from which the woman's voice had come. "Someone helped us," Sarah whispered, her face a mix of fear and confusion. Who was that? Abel didn't have an answer, but he knew they couldn't stay in the woods. The hunt would start again. They needed to find their new unknown ally. Their only hope now was to find this person, someone who had defied the town's conspiracy of silence, someone who could help them get the ledger to the authorities. They were no longer just running. They were searching for the truth. And with every step, the terrifying secrets of redemption came closer to the surface. They followed the direction the woman's voice had come from, moving carefully through the dense undergrowth. The sun was now a hot, oppressive presence beating down on the forest floor. They walked for another hour, their exhaustion giving way to a new, desperate energy. They were no longer running from a simple threat. They were on a mission to find an unknown ally in a town where everyone seemed to have a part in a gruesome conspiracy. The woman's voice had been a lifeline, a moment of defiance in a world of complicity. They knew they had to trust her. They emerged from the woods into a small, secluded clearing. In the center stood a humble cabin, a far cry from the derelict one they had found earlier. A plume of smoke curled lazily from its chimney, and a small garden was neatly tilled beside it. A woman sat on a worn wooden bench, mending a fishing net. She was older, her face etched with the lines of a hard life, but her eyes, when she looked up, were sharp and knowing. "I knew you'd come," she said, her voice calm and steady, the same voice that had saved them in the woods. "I've been watching the road. The whole town's in a tizzy. They're saying you're thieves." Abel and Sarah approached her, wary but relieved. "Who are you?" Abel asked. "My name is Martha," she said, putting her mending aside, "and I know what's going on in that church. I was part of it, a long time ago." Her words hit them like a physical blow. Martha had been a member of the syndicate. She was one of them. Abel's hand instinctively went to his knife, but Martha held up a hand, a tired, sad smile on her lips. "I'm not one of them anymore," she said. "I got out, a long time ago. My husband, he wasn't so lucky. He went in to help with the harvest, as they call it, and he never came back. They told me he died in a cave-in. But I knew he was just another body in the ledger." Martha led them into her cabin. It was small and sparsely furnished, but it was clean and neat. She offered them water and a small loaf of bread, which they devoured with a hunger that was both physical and emotional. They told her what they had found: the ledger, the tunnels, the phosphorus. "Phosphorus," she said, her voice flat. "That's it. They found a vein of it years ago. The old German immigrants they knew, they built the church over it, a symbol of their new home. But a group of townsfolk, they found the vein, and they decided they could make a fortune off it. But it's toxic. The fumes, they make you sick. The miners, they don't last long. So they started with their own." Martha's words confirmed Abel's theory. The harvest was a grim cycle of kidnapping, forced labor, and murder. The choir was a constant, low-level torture, a way to break the new victims, to wear them down and make them compliant. The sermons were lessons on the glory of their new purpose, a twisted form of indoctrination designed to make them accept their fate. "The leader," Martha said, her eyes darkening. "He's the one who orchestrates it all. He's not from here. He came years ago, a man named Preacher Josiah. He's a charismatic man, and he got the townsfolk to believe that this was their path to a new, prosperous life. He made them complicit. He made them turn a blind eye." The name hit Abel like a thunderclap. Preacher Josiah. Abel had heard the name before in another town years ago. He was a fraud, a man who used religion and charisma to build a following, to exploit people for his own gain. Abel had been a victim of one of his schemes in the past, a land deal that had left him with nothing. Abel had been trying to outrun his past, but his past had found him in the most unexpected way. "He's the serpent," Abel said, a new, terrible understanding dawning on him. "He's not a symbol, he's a man, and he's a devil." Martha nodded. "He controls them all through fear. He's smart. He's manipulative, and he knows how to keep a secret." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the new information hanging in the air. They were no longer just fugitives. They were a small, fragile resistance against a powerful, entrenched evil. They had the evidence, and they had a new, unexpected ally. But they were still in redemption, and Preacher Josiah's influence was everywhere. They needed a plan, a way to expose the truth without getting caught. The sun was now high in the sky, a harsh, uncaring witness to the darkness that lay beneath the surface of this seemingly peaceful town. The air in Martha's small cabin was thick with the weight of their new knowledge. The pieces of the puzzle, once scattered and confusing, now fit together into a chilling picture of human depravity. Preacher Josiah, the master manipulator, had built his fortune on the backs of the desperate, and the town of Redemption was his latest, most gruesome project. The night church wasn't a place of worship. It was a factory of suffering, a tomb for the living. "We can't take the ledger to Jefferson City," Martha said, her voice grim. "They'll be waiting for you. They'll have men on every road. They'll have spread a story that you're a wanted man, a criminal. They'll use your past against you, Abel." Abel's heart sank. Martha was right. His past was a liability, a weakness that Josiah would exploit. He had a reputation for running from trouble, a past he was trying to forget. Now, that past was being used as a weapon against him. "So what do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice laced with desperation. "We have the proof. We have to show them. We have to make them see." "The townspeople won't believe us if we just show up with a book," Martha said. "They're too afraid. They've been taught to look the other way. We need to expose them from the inside. We need to show them the truth, a truth they can't deny." Martha's eyes were fixed on Abel. A new plan was forming in her mind, a risky, terrifying plan. "The next harvest is tonight. A young boy named Samuel. His father is a prominent member of the choir. He's been sick for weeks. They'll take him tonight. We need to get in there, and we need to show them what's really happening. We need to expose Preacher Josiah for the monster he is." The plan was simple and insane. They would use Martha's intimate knowledge of the church's inner workings to get inside. They would wait for the right moment, a moment when the townspeople, gathered for the service, were at their most vulnerable. And then they would strike. They would expose the underground mine, the suffering, the lie. "We'll use the old trapper's trail to get close," Martha said, sketching a crude map on the dirt floor of the cabin. "It'll bring us out behind the church. There's an old well there, a dry one, that leads to the mines. It's the old way, before Preacher Josiah and his men built the new tunnel." Abel looked at the map, his mind a whirlwind of doubt and fear. He was not a fighter. He was a man who had spent his life running. But he looked at Sarah, her face filled with a grim, fierce resolve, and he knew he couldn't back down. He wasn't just fighting for Elias and for the town. He was fighting for his own redemption. "What do we do when we get down there?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "How do we expose them?" "We'll wait for the harvest," Martha said. "When they bring the new victim down, we'll follow them. We'll show them the truth. We'll show them what they've been ignoring. They'll have to believe their own eyes." The hours leading up to dusk were a tense, silent vigil. They waited in the cabin, their senses on high alert. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange. As darkness fell, the first low guttural notes of the choir began to rise from the hill, the symphony of suffering. They made their way through the dark, their movements silent, their hearts pounding in unison. The old trapper's trail was overgrown and treacherous, but Martha led the way with a grim determination. The closer they got, the more terrifying the sounds became. The chanting was a low, mournful drone, but beneath it, Abel could hear it now, the faint, undeniable sound of weeping. They reached the well, a crumbling stone structure hidden behind a thick stand of trees. Abel shone his lantern into the darkness, revealing a narrow ladder leading down into the depths. The air was cold and stale, carrying with it the faint, sickly sweet scent of phosphorus. "Are you ready?" Martha asked, her voice a low whisper. Abel looked at Sarah, her face illuminated by the lantern's glow, her eyes a mirror of his own fear and resolve. They had come this far. There was no turning back now. They had a chance to end the suffering, to expose the monster who had brought this town to its knees. "We're ready," Abel said, and he started down the ladder, a man on a mission, no longer running from his past, but facing it head-on. If the tension is keeping you on the edge of your seat, just wait until you see what's coming next. We're halfway through this chilling tale, and the truth is about to be revealed. Don't miss the rest of the story. Be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can join us for every terrifying twist. The descent into the well was a plunge into the heart of redemption's darkness. The stone walls were slick with moss and damp earth, and the ladder groaned under their weight. The air grew colder with every step, and the stench of raw phosphorus became a thick, cloying presence that clung to their clothes and hair. The sounds of the night, the rustling of leaves and the distant drone of the choir, were muffled by the earth, replaced by the hollow echoes of their own breathing and the frantic pounding of their hearts. They finally reached the bottom, their boots sinking into a thick, muddy floor. Abel's lantern cast a weak circle of light, revealing a narrow tunnel leading off into the darkness. Martha led the way, her movements sure and confident, a guide in a landscape of human suffering. The walls of the tunnel were not carved stone, but raw earth, and the air was heavy with the smell of damp soil and something else. A coppery, metallic scent that Abel now recognized as Preacher Josiah's true harvest. They walked for what felt like an eternity, the tunnel winding deeper and deeper into the earth. The air became thick with a strange, glowing dust that floated like fireflies in the beam of Abel's lantern. It was phosphorus dust, a silent, deadly killer. Abel pulled a bandana over his mouth and nose, a grim imitation of the masks the miners would have worn. Sarah and Martha did the same. The sound of their footsteps was suddenly drowned out by a low, rhythmic thudding. It was the sound of a pickaxe striking rock, a monotonous, relentless rhythm that spoke of endless labor. They were getting close. They moved more slowly now, their senses on high alert. The tunnel opened up into a larger cavern, and Abel's lantern beam swept over a scene of unimaginable horror. It wasn't a cavern, but a makeshift mine. Dozens of men, their faces gaunt and pale, their eyes hollow with exhaustion, worked in the dim light of lanterns hanging from the ceiling. They were dressed in rags, their bodies streaked with mud and a strange, sickly yellow dust. Their hands and faces were covered in raw, festering sores, a testament to the corrosive effects of the phosphorus. They were not just victims, they were ghosts. They worked in silence, their movements slow and listless. A few men stood guard, their faces hidden by crude masks, their hands on their rifles. They were the enforcers, the ones who ensured the choir kept singing and the harvest kept coming in. Abel's eyes scanned the cavern, searching for Elias. He saw a young man slumped against a rock, his body racked with a hacking cough, his face caked with the yellow dust. He was no older than Elias. Sarah saw him too. She gasped. a small, choked sob escaping her lips. It was him. "He's alive," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He's alive." But was he? Elias was a shell of the man he had once been. He looked like a man who had been tortured for weeks, a man who had lost all hope. This was the harvest. Not a ritual sacrifice, but a slow, agonizing process of extraction, of turning human beings into tools, into a means to an end. And then, Abel saw him, Preacher Josiah. He was standing on a small wooden platform, watching the miners with a cold, detached expression. He was not a man of God. He was a businessman, a cold, calculating monster who saw a town full of desperate people as a resource to be exploited. "The harvest is abundant tonight," Preacher Josiah's voice boomed across the cavern. "Another soul will be blessed by the light of the Lord." He gestured to a group of men who were bringing a new victim into the mine. It was a young boy, no older than 12, his face pale with sickness. It was Samuel. His father, a burly man with a permanent scowl, was with him, a look of quiet, resigned terror on his face. He was complicit, but he was also a victim. They had taken his son as payment, a grim tax for his obedience. Abel's hand clenched around the hilt of his knife. He couldn't just stand there and watch. He couldn't let this continue. He had to act. He looked at Sarah and Martha. They were ready. The moment was upon them. They had to expose him now, before another innocent life was consumed by the greed of this man. Abel crept out from their hiding spot, the ledger held tight in his hand. He took a deep breath, the air burning his lungs. This was it, the moment of truth. He was no longer a man running from his past. He was a man fighting for a future, for a town that had forgotten how to fight for itself. He was here for redemption, and he would have it one way or another. Abel's sudden movement drew the attention of the guards. A shout echoed through the cavern, and a rifle was raised. But Abel didn't stop. He ran, not towards the guards, but towards the wooden platform where Preacher Josiah stood, a look of bewildered surprise on his face. "What is this?" Josiah's voice boomed. "Who are you?" "I'm the man you tried to run out of town," Abel shouted, his voice hoarse from the dust and fury. "And I'm here to show these people what you really are." He held up the ledger, its pages a damning testament to Josiah's crimes. The miners, their faces caked with dust and grime, stopped their work. Their hollow eyes, once filled with listless despair, now held a flicker of curiosity, a spark of hope. "He's a thief!" Preacher Josiah screamed, his face contorting into a mask of pure rage. "He stole from the Lord's house. He's a fraud." "Am I?" Abel yelled, flipping through the pages. "These are not hymns, these are names. Names of people you kidnapped, people you tortured and killed for your own profit. This is not a church, it's a mine, a tomb." The guards, a mix of townsmen and hired muscle, now had their guns leveled at Abel. But they hesitated. The words had an impact. They had been told they were doing God's work, that the harvest was a divine blessing, but the reality they were witnessing was anything but. "He's lying," Josiah shrieked, his composure crumbling. He pointed a trembling finger at Abel. "He's a criminal, a killer. Ask him. Ask him what he did in Kansas. He left a man to die in the dirt." The words hit Abel like a physical blow. Josiah had done his homework. He had delved into Abel's past, found the one weakness he had tried so hard to outrun. The miners looked at Abel with a new wariness. The spark of hope was replaced by a flicker of doubt. "It's true," Abel said, his voice quiet, his gaze fixed on the miners. "I did. A long time ago. I left a man to die. I ran from my past. I came to redemption to escape it. But the difference is, I know what I did, and I live with it every day. But what about you, preacher? What about what you did? What about the blood on your hands?" His words hung in the air, a final, damning challenge. Sarah, seeing her chance, screamed, "Elias, he's here! He's alive! My brother, he's right there!" She pointed to Elias, who, with a flicker of newfound strength, had pushed himself to his feet. The father of young Samuel, seeing his son being led away, saw Elias, and in that moment the dam of his complicity broke. He was a father first, and a frightened townsman second. He let out a roar of rage and lunged at the guards, knocking one off balance. The miners, seeing the act of rebellion, saw their chance. A man dropped his pickaxe and charged another guard. A chain reaction began. The hollow-eyed ghosts of the mine, once docile and broken, were now a raging mob. The cavern erupted in chaos. The guards, outnumbered and surprised, were overwhelmed. Preacher Josiah, seeing his control slip, tried to flee, but Abel was too fast. He grabbed him, his hands closing around the man's throat. "This isn't about me anymore," Abel snarled, his eyes burning with a righteous fury. "This is about them. This is about Elias. This is about all the lives you destroyed for a few pieces of rock." He held Preacher Josiah in a grip of iron, forcing him to face the very people he had exploited. The miners, their faces streaked with blood and dust, stared at him, their silent accusation a more powerful condemnation than any words. The father of Samuel knelt beside his son, embracing him. Elias, seeing Sarah, finally let out a choked sob. He was a ghost, but he was a ghost who had been given a second chance. In the ensuing chaos, one of the enforcers, a man with a wild look in his eyes, pointed a rifle at Abel. Sarah, seeing his intent, grabbed a piece of loose stone and threw it, hitting him in the head. The rifle discharged, the bullet going wild, but the sound echoed through the cavern, a final note in the symphony of violence. The man collapsed, and the fight was over. Preacher Josiah, his face a mask of terror, looked at the miners, at Abel, and at the truth that had been exposed. He was a monster, and he had been caught. He had no control anymore. The charisma, the power, the money, it was all gone. All that was left was a scared, pathetic man trapped in the tomb he had built for others. The chaos of the mine gave way to a somber, stunned silence. The miners, freed from their shackles of fear and labor, stared at Preacher Josiah, their eyes a mixture of disbelief and quiet fury. The man who had promised them salvation had been their jailer, and the church they had been told was their sanctuary had been their tomb. Abel, his hands still gripping the terrified Preacher Josiah, felt the righteous anger slowly ebb away, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He had faced his past, not by running, but by confronting a far greater evil. He had not only found redemption for himself, but had helped to bring it to a town that had forgotten what the word meant. The townsfolk who had served as guards, their faces now pale with shame, dropped their weapons. They were not evil men, just men consumed by fear, manipulated by a master of deceit. Silas, the saloon keeper, his nose a broken mess, knelt on the floor, his face in his hands. The man who had once been a symbol of the town's quiet complicity was now a symbol of its brokenness. Sarah rushed to Elias, wrapping her arms around him. He was a skeletal version of her brother, his body a fragile vessel of the horrors he had endured. He was alive, though, and that was all that mattered. The sight of them together was a small beacon of light in the dark, dusty cavern. Martha, her face a mask of grim satisfaction, looked at the defeated Preacher Josiah. "The harvest is over," she said, her voice filled with a finality that spoke of years of buried grief. "Your song is done, Josiah." With the threat neutralized, the focus shifted to the task at hand. They had to get the miners out, and they had to bring Preacher Josiah and his accomplices to justice. The father of young Samuel helped lead the men out of the mine, his shame now replaced by a burning desire to make things right. As they emerged from the well and into the pale light of dawn, the townsfolk, drawn by the commotion and the unusual silence of the choir, were gathered on the hill. They saw the miners, their faces gaunt and bruised, and they saw Preacher Josiah, his face streaked with grime and terror, his hands bound. The sight was a final, undeniable proof of the truth. The conspiracy of silence shattered like glass. Whispers turned to shouts, and shouts turned to a wave of collective outrage. The townspeople, once complicit in their ignorance, now saw the monster in their midst, and they moved as one, a force of justice and anger that Abel had never seen before. A rider was sent to Jefferson City to fetch the U.S. Marshal. For the first time in months, the sun rose over redemption without the oppressive shadow of fear. The night church stood as a silent monument to a terrifying secret, but it was no longer a place of horror. It was a place of memory, a place where a town had learned a brutal lesson about the cost of looking away. Elias was slowly nursed back to health, his mind scarred by the experience but his spirit unbroken. He and Sarah, together with Martha, began the long process of helping the town heal, of rebuilding the trust that had been shattered. Abel, having seen his mission through to the end, finally felt a sense of peace. He had not run. He had not looked away. He had faced his demons, both from his past and from the town of redemption. He had not found redemption in a place, but in an act. He was no longer a man on the run. He was a man who had stood up and fought for what was right. He stayed in redemption for a while, a quiet figure in a town that was slowly finding its way back to life. He helped rebuild the community, to put the pieces back together. When the time came for him to leave, he did so without a backward glance. He was no longer running. He was just moving on, his past a part of him, but no longer the thing that defined him. As he rode out of town, the spire of the Mount Zion Church was just a speck on the horizon. It was no longer a symbol of terror, but a reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of a quiet town, and the courage it takes to bring it into the light. The screams had been mistaken for hymns, but the truth, once revealed, was a song of a different kind. A song of justice, of resilience, and of a long overdue redemption.